When it comes down to chronic stress, it seems like we are way more stressed out now than our ancestors were. The reason is stress is something that was meant to be very short-lived. You're supposed to react quickly to a life or death situation. This is why it's called our fight or flight response. Now, there probably were things that stressed our ancestors out other than fighting off lions and tigers and bears, etc. But in general, this is what stress is supposed to be. The problem is today's stressors are full of these imagined dangers because they're full of these non-life-threatening situations where people tend to overreact to. But the problem is the biochemical and physiological responses in your body are going to be the same. Whether you're fighting off a bear or a tiger, or whether you're stuck in traffic and you're pissed off because someone just cut you off, both of those are going to cause the same fight or flight response in your body. And the problem is that one of those responses is justified and one of them is not. Because either way, your heart rate's going to go up, your breathing rate is going to go up, your blood pressure is going to go up. All of the things that happen in a stress response will go up. But it won't always be justified for the situation. For example, if you have to fight off a lion, God, I hope none of you have to do that. But if that were the situation, you would need that increased heart rate, you would need that increased blood pressure, you would need that increased breathing rate because you have to either get out of that situation or fight for your life. But if you're sitting in traffic and you're just sitting in your car and you're mad at the person in front of you, you don't need all those increased biomarkers. And this is where it can become really unnecessary, and this is where it can become chronic stress. So this is the problem. And I think stress management tools are very important and very effective. And some of you might have your own that work for you. And I think that's very great. And I encourage that. So if you rely on music or therapy or spa or exercise or different hobbies, even meditation or yoga, spending time in nature, whatever it is, if it works for you and it's de-stressing you, make sure you keep doing it. But the thing is, like I said before, stress isn't just emotional. Remember I said there's 3 types of stress. First one is emotional, but there's also a functional stress, which is what you're doing. So if you have a high stressful job, like you're a construction worker or you're very, very physically active, or I just put you out in the cold or a very hot environment, all of those things are going to stress you out. And the third type of stress, like I mentioned before, is your ingestional stress. So what you're eating and also inhaling will also cause stress. We're going to get more into inhaling in just a little bit, but in terms of what you're eating, a lot of the processed foods, a lot of the chemical additives, and a lot of the crap that they put in our food now, studies are showing that this can also evoke some stress response in our body. So probably the first thing that your stress will change is your breathing rate. We talked before about how it affects your heart rate, your blood pressure, etc. But the first thing that will change is your breathing. And the cool thing about your breathing is you can always switch your breathing to manual mode. And when you switch it to manual mode, you can use some tools to help kind of trick your body to go more into a parasympathetic or a rest and relax mode. Now, I'm going to give you guys the first trick I have to help lower your stress levels. This is something that you can do right on the spot in real time. This will only take about a couple minutes. So normally what happens when we're stressed out is our breathing rate will go up and we'll start using our mouth to breathe and we'll start using just the upper half of our chest to breathe. The problem is this will put us into kind of never-ending cycle because you can just increase your stress response right now by hyperventilating and doing this quicker breathing. So instead, what you need to do is you need to only use your nose and you need to do a normal inhale, but a prolonged, exaggerated, slow exhale. So it'll look kind of like this. Now you probably looked at me like I didn't do anything, but that's exactly how it should look. You should do a normal inhale, but you want to do a very effortless exhale and make it very exaggerated and very long and longer than your inhale. And if you keep doing this and you keep the breathing really slow, in just about 2 minutes, you should start to calm down. Now, another thing you can do while you're doing this is put your hands on your lower ribs. And as you're inhaling, you want to feel your diaphragm kind of push your hands out. If your hands are not moving and just your upper chest is moving, then you're not doing this correctly. You want to make sure that you use your diaphragm, and the way to do that is to engage your belly and engage the lower half of your lungs. So once you start to see your lower hands start to move, or you kind of push against your ribs a little bit and you feel a little bit of resistance, that means that you're doing it correctly. Now, when you think about doing this, you might feel like that is doing the exact opposite of what you want to do, because you might feel like you need to take big gulps of air. But this is a really common myth. Really common myth is people, when they get stressed out, they want to take really deep, long gulps of air. So what they do is they take a big breath through their mouth, like, oh. The problem is this is actually doing more harm than good. And ironically, it may actually lower your ability to get oxygen into your cells. Because basically what happens is when you're mouth breathing in general, you are taking these quicker, faster breaths, and you are depleting your body of a molecule called carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is a very important molecule. And without this molecule, we will not be able to deliver the oxygen that we get into our cells to go to our lungs. And no matter what, if we're taking these big breaths, we are getting a lot of oxygen into our lungs. But just because it goes to our lungs, it doesn't mean it's going to our cells. You can put one of those pulse oximeters on your finger and record your oxygen saturation levels, and that will record how much oxygen is attached to the hemoglobin once it gets into your lungs. But the hemoglobin has to be able to deliver it to all of your cells, and without enough of the CO2, it cannot do that. So just because your oxygen saturation levels are high, it doesn't mean that your oxygen is going to the right places. This is why hyperventilating and taking these bigger breaths are so bad for you, because your body doesn't need that oxygen. It needs more CO2. It has more than enough oxygen already. Also, in general, with mouth breathing, we tend to only use the upper half of our lungs. And when we do that, we also further enact the sympathetic nervous system. So we further kind of put us in this fight or flight mode, or this anxious and stressed out mode. Instead, what you need to do is you need to use your nose and your diaphragm. And when you use your nose and your diaphragm together, you get air to the bottom half of your lungs. And side note, in the bottom half of your lungs, that's where the majority of your blood flow is. So it's going to help you even more breathe more efficiently and get that oxygen more efficiently to all of your cells. But again, the technique is going to be a normal, slow inhale and a very slow, exaggerated, long exhale. Now, you might be wondering also, why am I doing a slow, exaggerated exhale? Am I just doing it for fun? No, there's actually some science behind it. So in a nutshell, when you inhale, this will drive your sympathetic mode, and when you exhale, this will drive your parasympathetic mode. So basically, if you inhale more than you're exhaling, you will be more stressed out because you will put your body into a more sympathetic mode. Ideally, humans need to have a certain ratio because you want to have a good balance of both of these. So ideally, our ratio should be 40% of the time inhaling and 60% of the time exhaling. And that will put us at a kind of ideal balance. But the problem is that a lot of people who are chronically stressed out or chronically have these imagined dangers, especially people in the westernized society, they kind of live in reverse. So they have more 60% inhaling and 40% exhaling. And also what's interesting is this is actually the reason that we sigh. And this is the reason that we feel more relief when we sigh, because our body is basically forcing us to go into a more parasympathetic mode by forcing us to have an exaggerated exhale. Now, sighing in general is a sign that you are overbreathing. So if you ever catch yourself sighing, or if you ever see someone else sighing and they just sitting around, they go, it's a sign that, first of all, that they're stressed out, but also a sign that they are breathing too excessively. And in a nutshell, the reason is because when you are an overbreather and you're breathing too excessively, again, you're depleting your body of a molecule called CO2 or carbon dioxide. And one interesting thing about CO2 is our brainstem will kind of monitor our CO2 levels. And when they detect a certain amount of CO2, they will determine it's time to take the next breath. So if our CO2 levels start rising and they get up to a certain threshold, that's when our body will automatically take the next breath without us even thinking about it. But when we chronically deplete ourselves of CO2 by taking these quicker breaths, then our CO2 levels will start to drop. Our body, because our body has this sort of neuroplasticity, it will adapt to these lower levels of CO2, and it'll think that that's the new normal. So it'll start taking breaths quicker and quicker because it will not allow that CO2 to build up. Because normally our CO2 will build up when our body is just undergoing metabolism. We don't get it from the air around us. So our CO2 will build up basically when we're holding our breath. So the more we hold our breath, the higher our CO2 levels will get. And if we're breathing too quickly, then we're not allowing our CO2 levels to get that high. and then our body will adapt to that new normal. So we'll start taking quicker and quicker breaths, and we'll be adapted to that lower level of CO2. So next time you have the urge to sigh, it would be better to resist that urge, because it may feel good in the moment because you're exhaling and getting rid of that CO2. But instead, if you resist the urge to sigh, instead you're going to be training your body to get used to a higher level of CO2 and get back to what's considered normal again. So a way to resist sighing is, one, just catch yourself doing it and don't do it, or every time you feel the urge to sigh, to actually swallow instead. And sometimes you might not catch yourself doing it. Sometimes you might sigh and go, like, oh crap, I just sighed. What you got to do then is just simply hold your breath. You just got to hold your breath for 5 to 10 seconds, and that'll kind of make up for that sigh and make up for that loss of CO2. Now, I know this can get a little confusing, but I'm going to make another video more about simply breathing techniques and things you can do to increase your CO2 levels and get healthier again. And I don't want to get too much into that in this video because I kind of want to focus on the stress part of it, and I don't want to get too divergent on it. But when it comes to prolonged exhales, there was another study kind of further proving that this prolonged exhales can work. So they took 10 healthy men between the ages of 21 to 28, and they put them under some stress by doing this spontaneous rapid breathing. So they activated their sympathetic nervous system. Then they had them all perform prolonged exhales. So they had them do 4-second inhales and 6-second exhales. So they got that 40 to 60% ratio. And the results were that their parasympathetic function was activated. And what happened was their heart rate variability went up and they started to calm down. So your heart rate variability is basically a measure of your nervous system balance. So in a nutshell, your higher heart rate variability means that you are less stressed out and means that more of your parasympathetic mode is activated. So they found that doing this prolonged exhale worked and it helped calm these people down. Now, another trick you can try, and this one might sound a little crazy, is left nostril breathing. Yes, I said that right. Just using your left nostril to breathe. Now, the reason that this can work is studies have found that your left and your right nostril are different, not just because they're on different sides of your face, but because the left nostril is more connected with your parasympathetic nervous system, and your right nostril is more connected with your sympathetic nervous system. And also, the left nostril will feed blood to the right side of your brain. And the right nostril will do the opposite. It'll feed blood to the left side of your brain. Now, if you don't remember, the right side of your brain is basically associated with creativity, and the left side of your brain is associated with more logic, language, and computing. So just by simply forcing yourself to breathe through your left nostril, you can put your body more into a parasympathetic mode, especially in times when you're stressed out. So ideally, we would have a balance with our body. And you want to make sure you have a balance. You don't want to be too much on one side versus another. And there was a study kind of showing that. So there was this schizophrenic woman, and they recorded her breathing patterns over the course of 3 years, a total of 1,086 days. And they found that over those 3 years, she had a significantly greater left nostril dominance. You might be thinking, well, if she's schizophrenic, why is she using her parasympathetic system more? Well, here's where that balance is so important. And what the study thought was going on was basically she was likely overstimulating the right side of her brain, that creative part of her brain. And as a result, she was making her imagination go kind of crazy. And over several sessions of training her to breathe through her right nostril and activating the left side of her brain, which is, again, that logical part of your brain, that she was able to experience far fewer hallucinations. Now, you might be wondering how the heck we can know that one side of our nostril will affect one part of our brain and another nostril will affect a different part of our brain. So we have something called nasal cycles, and these are actually part of our autonomic nervous system. So you might notice that occasionally the left nostril is a little bit more dominant, and then other times your right nostril is a little bit easier to breathe out of. That's actually normal. And usually this dominance will switch every 2 hours. And there was actually a study, and they were looking at people's brains. So they hooked them up to EEGs or electroencephalograms, and they were studying their brain activity during these nasal cycles. And what they found is when people were breathing through the right nostril more, it was going to affect their left hemisphere of their brain a lot more, and they were seeing that light up in the EEG a lot more. And same thing with the opposite side. When they were breathing with their left nostril, they had way more power with their right hemisphere of the brain in the EEG. So ideally, the human body should keep this in balance on its own. But sometimes it needs a little bit of help because we're too much on one side. So there's actually a technique even in yoga where they do nasal cycling, where they practice breathing through one nostril and they switch it. So just remember, left nostril, more parasympathetic and right hemisphere of your brain, and right nostril, more sympathetic nervous system, and left side of your brain. So many people are really quick to blame their genes. They say, oh, I got my crooked teeth from my parents, or I got my small mouth from my dad, so I got my dad's teeth, or something like that. But if you look at our ancestors, they did not have these problems. And if you go by genetics, genetics cannot change that quickly.